So we have all of our blocks and they're ready to be put together as a quilt top. Now I'm going to show you one method for putting a quilt top together. And in order to do this, I've labeled row 1 and row 3. Now, if I had a larger quilt, I would continue to label all the odd number rows, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip row 2 on top of row 1, and then I'm going to take them from top to bottom, all right? So here we go, row 2 on top of row 1, and then I'm going from top to bottom. Okay, so my number is still there, all right? So I'm holding it from the top and I'm going to take it to my machine. And what I'm doing is I'm setting my blocks down so that that label is at the top, and this side facing the machine is the side we're going to stitch. Okay, I have thread in my machine and I've cleaned everything, and I'm going to pick this up, and again the side that's facing my machine is the side we're going to run through and stitch. I'm holding my threads until I get the first few stitches in the piece. I'm using my stiletto to hold everything in place. Now, I'm not going to run the piece all the way through yet, okay? I'm going to pick out my next set of blocks. I'm going to hold it in place, and now I'm going to feed that through. I call this assembly line sewing. Some people call it chain piecing. Line them up, feed that through. And I'm going to continue this until I have them all finished for this row. I'm going to take this over to the ironing board now. Here's the top. So we're going to flip these over. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to press these toward the solid squares that don't have a seam in them. Just going to do this all the way down, and I'm just doing a quick press. Just doing a little quick press. Okay, I'm not snipping the little thread. That little thread is going to act like a pin, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this, and I'm going to run this through my machine. And I put a pin in it just to make sure it stays. I'm going to grab my thread and start sewing. gonna stop. When you stop, put the needle down so nothing shifts. Take that pin out because we don't want to sew over the pin, because if that needle hits the pin, it will break your needle. And ask me how I know that. Continue stitching. Now, there's the first two. Now we're going to sew the next section. And again, I'm going to nest this seam here. And I'm going to put a pin there. Even though there's that thread there, it makes me feel better. And I'm going to stitch. Hold my thread. All right, so here we go. Run into a situation where maybe one side is a little bit longer just by a hair than the other side, turn it over and feed the side that's longer on the bottom, and the feed dogs will help take up a little bit of that difference so that it stitches nicely. I just happened to notice while I was stitching that piece underneath is just a little bit longer. So again, put it on the underside, on the bottom, and your feed dogs will help gather up anything extra. Okay. Okay, so now we have this done. And now we're going to fold it and do the next one. And we're just going to keep doing this all the way down. This is my top. Okay. I'm going to press all these cross seams toward the top. Okay. Like this. And now I'm going to press those side seams down really well. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over and give it another good pressing. Another good pressing. And I'm lifting as I go. And I'm pressing those seams, these cross seams, toward the top where my label is. All right. Okay. To recap, row 2 went on top of row 1. And then I took them from top to bottom, okay? Now we're going to do the same thing with row 4 and 3. Row 3 and row 4 are stitched. Now, on row 1 and 2, we iron these seams toward the top. Now, in order for these seams to nest, when I put those two joinings together, row 2 and 3, I have to iron these toward the bottom, the opposite of the tag. So I'm going to turn this over. Okay, just going to give that a press. Give this a press. So I'm pressing this seam toward the solid square. So we have 1 and 2, 3 and 4, okay? These seams going across, this section we press toward the label. This row we press these seams toward the bottom. And that's way these cross seams right here will nest. All right, now we have an odd row here. So this is what I'm gonna do. I know this is row 5 because it's the last one on the end of the quilt. So I don't need to put a label there. But I am putting a pin. Okay, that's my marker. Okay, so I know that's the top. So I'm going to take these one at a time on top of one another. I'm going to take these to my sewing machine. This is my pin. Now, I want my seam that's going to get sewn to be next to my machine. It's not the side seam, it's the bottom seam because this is one single row, okay? So watch how I do this. This is my top block. I'm going to pull this in this direction, okay? Because I'm going to work my way down. This seam, this top seam is the one we're working on. So we're going to flip this 4 patch here, and this is the seam we're sewing. Let me do that again. Let me do that again. Let me do that again. Okay, it's a single row. Okay. Here's my pile, here's my pin. That's the top of the single row, okay? This seam's not getting sewn. It's this bottom seam of this top piece. So I'm gonna turn this, okay? Here's the top of my single row. This is the seam that's gonna get sewn. So I'm gonna pull this to the left. I'm gonna flip this on top of that block, and this is the seam right here that's going to get sewn. So I'm going to line these up like so. Okay, now open it up like this, okay? Here's my top block. Here's that second block. We're going to move this to the left, okay? This seam right here is the seam we're sewing. It's facing the machine. I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to line these up. And I'm going to sew. Okay, now, here's my first block, move it over to the left, okay? This block is going to get flipped because this seam right here is the seam that's going to get sewed and it's facing my machine. I'm going to flip this over, line it up. Hold my threads and stitch. turn it over. I'm sorry, move it to the left. This is my last block. Flip it, line it up, put it under my presser foot, hold my threads, stitch. Okay, now this is my top, because here's my pin. Now I know that last row we press toward the bottom of that row, so that means this row we're going to press toward the top. There's my pin. Okay, I'm going to press this toward the top, press it toward the top. Nice little press. Turn it over. Okay, let's get it on the wall. All right, 3 sections. All right, now you can do this one of 2 ways. You can flip this section on top of this and sew this row, then sew the last row on, or you can sew the last row on to this section and then do the 2 wide sections. I'd rather do the narrow row to this section and then this section to this section because it's a little bit easier to manage, okay? I'm gonna flip it this way. And I'm going to pick it up like this. I'm going to take it to my machine. I'm laying it down so that the side that has to be sewn is facing my machine, okay? I'm going to pin at every intersection. Quarter-inch seam allowance. From my needle to the edge of my presser foot, okay, should be a 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? The only way to really double check that is to double check your stitching. So I'm going to get out my little handy tool and I'm going to go over here.
And it measures a 1/4 inch.
You'll notice my edge and my fabric is just on the inside of my presser foot. It's not sitting on the outside. See how that's sitting a little bit on the outside? Whereas if I position it this way, the edge of the fabric is sitting a little bit underneath the presser foot on the inside. What that does is it gives you a more accurate seam allowance, because when you go to press, there's always a little bit of, it's almost like a little bump where the seam is. All right, that seam takes up a little bit of space in the fabric. So when you stitch and feed your fabric underneath the presser foot where it's just on the inside of the presser foot, it gives you a more accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Needle down. Take that pin out. Make sure that seam is going in that direction. So now I'm going to grab row 1 and 2. I'm going to pin my seams so that they nest nicely. and give it a little spritz because it's all together. And I want this to lay nice and flat, okay? And I've got some threads here that I need to trim. That's okay, I'll get them. Right now I'm just concentrating on getting it nice and flat. Okay. Well, I've measured the quilt. It's 40 inches across by 40 inches down. All right. So what I've done is I have a sheet that I've already trimmed down so that it's a few inches wider and a few inches longer than 40 inches. You should have at least 4 inches on both sides if you're going to be quilting this yourself. So what I've done is I've cleared off my table.
I lay my backing right side down and I tape the edges down to keep it in place. And when I tape it so that the backing is smooth, not completely taut. And in this way, when I'm done taking the pins out, it doesn't shrink back, so it's smooth but not taut. I lay the batting on top, and normally I would tape the batting in place, but since this is a small quilt, that's not necessary. I'm laying the quilt top on top. I'm smoothing it out to prepare it for the pins. Now the safety pins I use are curved safety pins that are nickel plated, and they are specifically made for quilt basting.
I'm going all the way down to the table until I feel that little bit of scrapiness. Popping back up through all 3 layers and then pinning. The nice thing about pins is once you buy them, I've had these for 25 years. Okay, shift, there we go. There we go. Put some along these edges. Hello, little girl. She wants some attention. Our little girl, our Summer, our puppy, our furry baby. She is spoiled, that's for sure. Okay, I'm going to trim. So before we begin machine quilting, now is a good time to stop and dust your machine, change the needle out, and just give everything a good dusting and a good oiling, because all of that piecing leaves a tremendous amount of dust in your machine. Now, because this video is about all machine piecing and machine quilting, I have what's called a walking foot. Okay. Now a walking foot helps feed the quilt sandwich through the machine evenly, because the feed dogs are working from the bottom of the quilt, and this adds a layer of feed dogs on top so that the sandwich is feeding through evenly without any pulling or dragging, okay? and this is called a walking foot. Now my walking foot is a Bernina walking foot, and it matches the mechanics of a Bernina. Your machine will have a walking foot that will work for your brand. So a Brother machine might have a walking foot made for Brother machines. A Pfaff may have a walking foot made for Pfaff, and so on and so forth. There is also what's called a universal walking foot that will work for many models. I have a universal walking foot that I use on my mother's original Singer, which is the original machine that I learned how to sew on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and attach this. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to turn my machine on. Okay, I'm going to move the camera over because I want to show you a couple of things. This right here is my stitch length. Normally, when I stitch piecing, I'm about a 2.5, okay, which is appropriate for machine piecing. But when quilting, I want a longer stitch length to accommodate the fact that I'm going through 3 layers. I'm going through the bottom layer, which is fabric. I'm going through the middle layer, which is batting, and I'm going through the top layer, which is the quilt top. So I want to be at about a 3.5. I want a longer stitch length. The other thing is my presser foot. I can ease the pressure, okay? So what that means is my machine, I can adjust. Okay, what I've done is I've used my lever so that when I engage this presser foot, the pressure is not as flat against the quilt. It's a little bit higher. And in that way, I'm adjusting for the width of how thick these 3 layers are, okay? If you can do those things with your machine, please do so. And that will help guide the quilt through as we machine quilt. So now I'm going to get my camera in place. I have quilt gloves, okay? And basically all these are, they're yard gloves. That's all they are. And this helps me grip my quilt. I'll show you one more thing before we get started. I'm going to cross hatch my stitching lines. I'm not going square stitching lines, I'm cross hatching. So I'm going to start rolling this from the corner. Sometimes while filming, little things happen, unexpected things. And while I was demonstrating how to quilt this quilt for you during this session, I didn't realize that my phone was going down to what was called low power mode. And sometimes when that happens, it will go into like a reserve mode. It stopped filming. That's okay. What I did was I did a diamond effect. Let me show you the back. So what I did was I started in the corner and I did cross hatching rather than following the line of the squares. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, in order to demonstrate how to do the quilting as a beginner quilter, I have this quilt that's ready to be quilted. And it's about the same exact size. And I'm going to quilt it the same way I did that one. I'm going to start in the corner here and cross hatch across. So give me a moment to get my table set up and get the camera in place, and then we'll get started. Okay, now I have my machine set up
And because I'm starting in a corner, I have to roll from a corner. So I've rolled one part. I'm gonna start at the top of my square. Okay. Now, what I'm gonna do is, well, first I have to remove the pin. What I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna line up my presser foot where I wanna start. I'm going to take one stitch. I'm gonna pull the top thread until that little loop from the bobbin thread shows on the top. I'm gonna pull the bobbin thread through the top so that both threads are on top. Then I'm gonna hold those threads as I start to stitch. And the reason why I'm doing that is it will prevent any little oopsies, like it'll prevent the thread from getting dragged down underneath the feed dogs and causing a knot on the back, and we call those knots bird's nests. Okay, so let me show you. Now my stitch length is set at a 2 because when I start, I'm going to take a few stitches at a very small stitch length to anchor the stitches before I adjust the setting for my stitch length to continue sewing. I'm going to take one stitch. Okay, it's a very small thread. I cut my thread really loose. Okay, I'm going to put down my feed dog. I'm going to take 2 or 3 stitches just to anchor the beginning of my row. I'm going to adjust my stitch length to 3.5, and I'm holding my hands like this, all right, and I'm concentrating on what's inside my thumb. And as I do this, I'm lifting up the rest of the quilt so that it's a little lighter. If this gets dragged on my lap, it pulls against the feed dog. So every once in a while, I lift the bulk up so that it doesn't drag against the feed dogs. And I'm only taking a few stitches at a time before I adjust. Forgot to put my glove on. This is a garden glove. I got it at the hardware store. It has grippy on it. It has grippy on the palm, and that helps hold your quilt as you're guiding it under your presser foot. It really helps your hands grip. There we go. Okay, again, I'm adjusting, smoothing it out. Okay, when I stop, remember to put the needle position down to hold everything in place. If you get close to a safety pin, stop. Take your foot off the foot pedal, because if you lean forward, your weight moves forward. You could possibly engage the foot pedal, which will engage the needle, and we don't want our fingers to accidentally be there. So whenever you do anything near that needle where you have to remove a pin or adjust or anything, take your foot off the foot pedal, just for a safety precaution. Okay, needle down, foot off the foot pedal. Time to remove the safety pin. How are we doing? Doing good this morning? I hope so. I'm getting to the last section, and I'm just sort of smoothing out that backing, just to make sure, you know, even though the pins are there, I want to make sure everything's smooth under there. Okay. When I get too close to where I'm going to stop, okay, I'm going to stitch. I'm stopping. Here's where I want to stop. I have about a 1/2 inch between the needle and where I want to stop. I'm going to lower my stitch length to about 2. I'm going to stitch up to where I want to stop. Okay. All right. I'm going to pull that out. Snip my top thread, snip my bobbin thread. All right, that's anchored. That's in there real well. Okay, and at this point, we can just snip the bobbin thread and the top thread. Okay, we don't need to pull the bobbin thread up because we're ending that row, okay? And those little stitches are enough to anchor the beginning and the end of your row. And that's how I start and stop my rows. Oh, here's some extra thread. Let's cut those off. Some quilters do not trim their threads when they start and stop a row. They wait till the very end. I trim mine only because if this were a very large quilt, you'd have a lot of threads to cut, and it just saves time and energy to do it as you're quilting it. So I'm going to adjust the camera again. Okay. I'm going to pull this out, and I'm going to start my next row, which is going to be right here. And I'm going to cross hatch it and cross these intersections where the 2 blocks meet. Okay. So let's get started. Put this underneath. Okay. I'm going to take 1 stitch, pull that bobbin thread up. Now when I do this, my foot is off the foot pedal. Okay. There's both threads. Okay. I'm going to position my needle right back to where I started. Going to take 2 or 3 anchor stitches. You can even do a little back stitch if you want. Going to adjust my stitch length back to the longer stitch length, because remember, when you're quilting 3 layers together, you don't want a tighter stitch, or that'll bunch up your quilting. You need a longer stitch to accommodate all 3 layers. Okay. So let's start. I'm going to roll that in position. Put my glove on. Fluff up what's on your lap so that it's nice and loose under here. And I'm only concentrating on this section in front of the needle, about 2-3 inches. I'm not concerned about this safety pin. It's on the side, so it's not going to interfere with the foot pedal. Okay, adjust. Got some threads here. am going at just a nice slow pace. I'm not zooming, you know. I'm not being a speed demon. Gonna adjust my stitch length down, go all the way to the corner, and just do one tacking stitch, okay? With the presser foot, take your foot off the foot pedal, trim that right down to the quilt top, grab that bobbin thread, snip that. So the things you want to remember with machine quilting: adjust your stitch length at the beginning and the end to anchor that row. I can adjust the pressure on my presser foot. If you have the ability to do that, do so. And sometimes you have to play around with the setting depending on the fabric you're using and the type of batting you're using. So that'll depend on the quilt you're using, which setting you use. But if it's a little bit less pressure, sometimes it's easier to guide it through. You want to make sure to have your hands in this position, or at least one hand in this position and the other hand holding that roll through. And sometimes I have a tendency to turn my wrist when I'm holding that roll. I have to remind myself to keep it flat, because if I do it while I'm turning my wrist, I'm causing tension within my hands, okay? So it's always important for me to hold that right side flat while I'm holding this side flat. You'll have less tension. Now, I don't have a table that drops my machine down, because in order for this to be really well for your tendons, your elbow and your arm must be in L position. Mine is like this. My arms are not in that position because my machine sits on top of the table. So because of that, if I get to the point where I feel as though I'm feeling a little bit of tiredness in my arms or my wrists or my shoulders, because that can travel up to your shoulders, any tension within your hands or your wrist, it's time to stop. So always remember to take breaks while you're machine quilting, because sometimes we get excited, I know I do, and I want to just get it done because I'm this close to being done. And you're going to feel that excitement too as a new quilter. Ooh, I want to finish this one because I already have 3 more in my head I want to start. Trust me. If it hasn't happened, it's gonna happen. You always have like 3 more in your head you want to start. But always remember to take breaks, and always remember to sort of relax your hands, you know, go for a walk, do dishes, fold laundry, you know, put on your favorite podcast for 30 minutes. Relax your arms and your shoulders, and put your feet up. Elevate your feet. Because we are in a sitting position for a very long time, it's not good for your circulation to be in a sitting position for a very long time. So if you do have a large quilt to quilt, take breaks to elevate your feet to keep all your circulation going. That's my best advice. So I'm going to continue quilting, and then when we meet back here, we're going to do the binding and finish our quilt. You get excited? It's exciting, and I'm excited for you. So meet me back here, and I'm going to show you how to put the binding on. Use a pin to secure your pieces. You're going to put them perpendicular to one another, and you're going to draw a line, a diagonal line, and then you're going to stitch directly on that line. Hold your thread and start your stitches. And remember, we're stitching directly on the line. And what this does is, because we're stitching diagonal and the strips are perpendicular to one another, when we lay that out flat, that seam goes across diagonally. And in this way, it disperses the bulk. Trim the excess fabric so that there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and trim the threads. I'm going to show you this one more time. You're going to line up the strips so that they're perpendicular to one another. You're going to draw a line from one corner to the opposite corner, stitch directly on the line, then you're going to trim the excess and leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. In this way, when you press your long strip, that seam is dispersed and it doesn't create bulk. First, you're going to press your seams open, and I use a steam iron for this. And then once the seams are all pressed open, you're going to lay out your binding, and you're going to press it in half along the length. When you start stitching the binding on, you're lining up the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt top. And I leave about a 10-inch tail, and then I start stitching on my machine, and I do a little back stitch just to secure the stitch. When I get to the end, close to the corner, I stop at a 1/4 inch from the raw edge of the next corner. I do a little back stitch, and then I take my quilt out from under the presser foot and I trim the threads. I turn the quilt so that I have the next side facing the machine. I'm going to fold the binding up so that it's straight up and it matches the raw edge on the side, and then I'm going to fold it down, and that fold is going to line up with the very top, and I'm tucking that excess under. And then when I begin stitching, I'm going to begin stitching at a 1/4 inch from the top of the edge, and I'm going to do a tiny little back stitch. Again, I'm stopping at a 1/4 inch away from the edge, doing a little back stitch. I'm pulling the quilt out, trimming threads. I'm turning it so that the side that I want to do next is facing the machine. I'm going to fold up the binding so that it's straight up, and then I'm going to fold it back, tucking the excess underneath, and where that fold is, it's going to line right up with the top of that edge. And then when I begin sewing again, I'm going to begin sewing at a 1/4 inch from the top edge and do a little back stitch. I'm going to do that all the way around until I get to approximately, I'd say 10 or 12 inches away from where I started. I'm stopping approximately 10 to 12 inches away from where I started. I did a little back stitch. I'm going to trim the threads. And then from here, I'm going to trim my binding, but I'm going to make sure they overlap by a 1/4 inch. I'm going to open them up and lay them right sides together, and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this is straight across, this is not on the diagonal. This last part, it's not a lot of bulk, so I'm okay with doing a straight seam when I attach the two ends together. It just sort of makes things easier for me. And it's only the one seam, so there isn't really a lot of bulk. But I do make sure that I finger press that seam open before I lay the binding down to continue stitching. trim the backing and the batting to match the raw edge of the quilt top and trim all the way around. The first part of the binding is on, and now we're going to start on folding it over. And what I do is I just fold it up. I'm going to move the camera. I fold it over to the back just so that it just covers that stitching line where I attached it to the front. And I'm going to move the camera so you can see that now. And you can see the stitching line here. Just going to fold it over like that. Okay. Now, at this point, we're hand stitching this down. Okay. So I'm going to take my pink thread, because I think that'll match nicely. There we go. I'm going to take a single length of thread. Okay. Thread my needle. Fold it over. Okay. I'm going to tie a knot at the end. This is how I do my knots. I cross the thread over the needle. Thread. Can you see it? And I put it across my needle and I'm pinching it. And then I wrap it twice, 3 times. And I'm pinching that little wrap, sliding it through the needle, and I'm pinching and I'm pulling the thread till I get to the bottom. And there's my knot. Okay, now I'm going to show you where I'm going to start. Never started a quarter. I'm going to go in that seam allowance like this. Going to hide my knot and take, one more stitch. Okay. Going to snip that tail. Okay, now going to grab some pins here. I'm pinching right where I come out. Okay, so right where the thread comes out from underneath the fold, we're going to go in to the background. Going to go into the back. But when we come up, we're going to grab the fold of the binding and pull through. Okay. Now, right where that thread came out, I'm going to go in to the background, come up, and that's about, quarter of an inch. I'm going to come up and grab the fold of the binding and pull through. Okay. And that is a blind stitch. So let me do it again. Here's my thread. I'm going to go in to the backing. I'm not going all the way through to the front. I'm going into the backing and the batting. I'm not going all the way to the front. When I come up, I'm grabbing the fold, just that fold of the binding, and I'm pulling it through. And that is a blind stitch. Okay, and I'm going to go all the way to the corner, and I'll show you how I do the corner. I choose thread that doesn't match the backing. Always choose thread that matches the binding, and that way it hides better. Okay? Always choose thread that matches the binding and it hides better. I'm now here, right here. I'm going to go in and come up, and I'm coming out. See it? Pull that needle, and I'm continuing down the next row. I'm going to do that all the way around. Oops, lost my needle. I'm going to do that all the way around until the binding is finished. Some quilters love this part, where they get to sit and stitch this last section. Some quilters machine stitch this part down. I've done both. And the only thing I can say about this part of the hand stitching is it reminds me of when I first started quilting, really quilting, when the bug bit me. I remember I always did large quilts for people to snuggle under. And at the time we lived in Columbus, and whenever I'd come home to visit, we'd stay at my mother's in her guest bedroom, and I always brought a project with me. And although my mother never sewed, she had a sewing machine, and she knew how to mend, and she knew how to hem pants and maybe hem sleeves and, you know, hem skirts and that sort of thing. It was not like her hobby, but it was always around. But anyway, whenever I would bring a big quilt home, we'd set the quilt on the dining room table, and she'd sit on one side and I'd sit on the opposite side, and she would help me stitch down the binding. And it was so enjoyable to just sit there and have our coffee and stitch the binding down. And so whenever I hand stitch a binding, I always think of that. And as a matter of fact, I should go over there one weekend and bring a quilt so she can help me stitch the binding down. She always enjoyed that with me. My sister does not sew. That bug never bit her. I have a couple of aunts that sew very well, actually. And on occasion, I would sew or crochet with my Aunt Emma. The one time she helped me sew a skirt together, and that was a lot of fun. And the one time she helped me sew a doll's dress for a doll that my grandmother had given me. And that was very enjoyable. I'm going to sit here and continue stitching. Here it is. Well, how does it feel? You completed your first quilt. If it's not your first quilt, is it still a beginner learning quilt? How does it feel? Every time I finish a quilt, I have such a sense of accomplishment, whether it's a simple 4-patch or maybe a pattern that I'm challenging myself with. You've now begun the journey of quilting. Enjoy yourself. Make the mistakes. Prick your fingers. Rip out seams. Do them over again. But you're going to love every minute of it. I guarantee it. I hope you enjoyed these basic beginner videos as much as I've enjoyed putting them together. Please click that like and subscribe button so that you don't miss any more videos. I'm going to have a lot more coming in the year 2025. Please leave comments. I love to hear from you. And always remember, why sleep when you can sew? I'm Angela Davis, and I'm the Forum Quilter.